Maybe you know this feeling. You go through your musical drafts and ideas and beats to see what kind of stuff you're going to use for your next song because you want to make some full song again. But just realize after a while, wow, all my stuff just basically sounds the same all the time. Which is why in this video I want to give you a few tips and tricks of stuff you can try in those situations where you feel like you're always repeating yourself and you're always using the same musical language. Hi, by the way, my name is Yannis, and number one is going to be to check your tempo. And this might sound incredibly banal, but I really encourage you to analyze your ideas, your beats, your drafts for the tempo, because it's quite likely you're going to have some favorite tempo you're almost always composing your stuff in. And I know from my own experience, both as some musician in bands but also producing music electronically, that it's the easiest thing to forget about because you're busy with sounds, with ideas, all the fancy stuff, but the tempo simply seems too banal to worry about. And by default, often the tempo is on 120 if you never changed it in Ableton Live. And let's say this is kind of the tempo you realized you always compose in. And I highly encourage you to just play with the tempo and, for example, make it super fast. Try, for example, 170. And of course, it sounds kind of silly if you just speed up everything, but then you have to listen for what actually sounds interesting. So in this case, I feel like, okay, the bass is a little too much for me, but the drum beat sounds kind of cool. And if we make some little adjustments, for example, duplicate the overall duration and put a snare drum a little to take a snare drum away and put some on some different positions, so it sounds more like some open drum and bass beat. This sounds quite exciting, and for the bass you can also start reducing notes. So right now it's kind of crowded with notes, but you can start extremely simple by just having the bass play on the one, because the drums are so busy and all of a sudden there's going to be some interesting interplay. And by doing this, we already peeked into number two, which is that you look for contrast inside your music. And by our little example here, we already have this contrast that the drums now are really busy and the bass is really sparse, just has a few notes. But we can make this more extreme by, while having some super short percussive drum part that is really busy, using a bass that is long, atmospheric, and just gives this overall layer instead of individual percussive sounds. And now I'm just using one very long note together with some dark resonant bass that morphs around, and together it sounds like this. And another example would be to use some super slow drum beats. So here I have some beat with a bass drum on the one, nothing for the whole bar because we're still in 170, it's quite fast, and then a snare on the beginning of the next bar. So it's like a 2-bar loop with just a bass drum and a snare drum. While for the bass I have some rhythmic figure, and it's again this kind of more percussive bass, and we turn around the rows and it sounds like this. Next thing is going to be one of my favorites because I'm a drummer myself, so rhythm is a big topic for me. And it's about analyzing your rhythmic patterns and coming up with something fresh. Because I often feel like people don't focus enough on rhythm or on getting additional ideas on making rhythms more interesting. While at the same time it's really easy inside the door because there's a system of just using groups of 2 and 3 that can allow you to basically come up with all sorts of funky sounding rhythms. And you can see the idea is that you either have 2 free slots or 1 free slot on a 16th note grid, and this way you can basically cover all rhythms that could be theoretically possible if you also sometimes mute a note, so maybe it's too much here or here. And of course sometimes you can also fill up the whole 16th note thing because always it's a system, but you have to break the system in order to make it interesting. But usually it's about this if you want to find some rhythm that sticks, so it's not just some random you draw something type of rhythm. By applying this principle, it always somehow sounds like almost some melody, because if you repeat this rhythm over time it gets stronger and it sounds like some repetitive kind of thing that people can relate to. And through this combination of 2 and 3, it also sounds danceable because we're creating some polyrhythm, and maybe that's kind of new to you, but at the same time I don't think it's so complicated, so I really encourage you to play around with this. By the way, if you're thinking this is all interesting but also only touching the surface because everything moves so quickly, we warmly invite you to check out the links down below in the description, because I'm going to link you further to some videos on YouTube where I go deeper on stuff I touched on here. And also I mentioned my online classes, because there you can even get a whole method on how to tackle, for example, rhythm or music production. Let's move on to point number 4, which is about chords and the fact that you should probably question them, or at least question the way you use them, because I experienced it many times that just some synth pad is smashed on top of the music, so it probably sounds like this. And don't get me wrong, it actually sounds super cool, especially with the spheric sound. I could dive into it and enjoy listening to it for quite a while. But this video is about breaking habits, so now we think that probably all your 10 drafts sound like this and you want to try something different. And there's just one big thing about chords, that they don't necessarily always have to be vertical. They can also happen horizontally, as they would do, for example, with some arpeggiator or a sequence, because you can perfectly anticipate the harmony with just a little melody, and I want to show you some example of this. And all you have to do is to analyze what kind of chord notes you use. In this case, it's like a C major 7 chord and like some D flat major 7 chord, just a C tone higher. And use the same notes for creating little melodies. And for the rhythm, you can remember the rhythmic concept I was showing you in step 3, and create those little inspiring melodies that at the same time create a lot of space. And I just feel like you have to try sometimes working without chords, because they take up so much space. And there's nothing wrong with it, but this way you also have more loops and options. And once your song evolves, you can also think of bringing back the chords in the end for some even stronger build-up. But this way your storytelling over the whole course of the song was also way more intense. Point number 5 catches up on those chords, and it's about not moving the bass all the time. The chords move as well, because there's this kind of thought that the bass is playing the root note of the chord, so if the chord changes you also have to change the bass, and often it's true and works, but at the same time it can make the music feel quite static. And what I really encourage you to try is to just stay on the same bass note, so you can either make the clip shorter or just move this kind of row of the higher note lower, and just see how this sounds like. It can create so much tension, and you can either use this throughout the whole song, but also at some point to create tension inside your arrangement. And even if you don't know much about music theory yet, that's something that you can do intuitively, because there are quite some combinations of bass notes with chords or the other way around that can work. And of course, there are also some that absolutely don't work, and you'll find them. But I just highly encourage you to play around with this relationship. Next point is about scales, and the scale is basically the collection of the notes you use for your melody, also your harmony or bass, basically everything that has a pitch. And there are so many scales around that it would be a shame to just always stick to the major and minor scale. And especially if you're using a DAW, it's just so simple, because in Ableton, for example, you have some MIDI effects, and one of them is called scale, and you can just use it. And under presets you can already select some scales, and what it just does is that whatever you feed into it by your keyboard or your MIDI grid, it's always going to use the tone of the specific scale you choose. But what's even more convenient is that once you click on the MIDI grid, again it's Ableton specific, but I think you can find those things in all types of DAWs, that you can activate the scale function, and right now it's just on C major, but we have some kind of different tone material here, more chromatics. And for example, I think we're kind of close to Phrygian, and don't worry about those words. It's just about trying different sounds. You can really be intuitive here. And so now, for example, you see we're using the E that is not part of it. So let's try how our melody sounds in Phrygian. And maybe it even sounds better. Let's just see. And it sounds a bit more like minor, but I also like it. Would totally work to use this type of scale for this song as well. And it's just really easy to use scale functions whenever you feel lost. Like if you just compose a melody, you don't know so much about music theory yet, just try opening a scale plugin, and sometimes you can also see what kind of notes you were using that were not part of a specific scale that is close to yours, and just fit your notes to the scale. Point number 7 is a little more on the philosophical side, but that's maybe where I like it the most. It's about not using drums at least once in a song. And you might wonder, like, why? First of all, also because I'm a drummer, so why do you have to get rid of drums? And from my own experience, I can tell you that as soon as you don't use drums, you're really forced to check the other elements for rhythmic clarity, because you easily forget about it. And it always makes me think of my experiences as being a drummer in bands, where also you would sometimes have a part where you'd be, okay, let's check it without the drums. And you'd see everything is falling to pieces because people can't rely on drums anymore, and suddenly realize that their own timing just isn't good enough or isn't clear enough for still making the music work. And even if you're programming your stuff, it's the same thing, because you can always rely on this cool drum beat, and if stuff around it isn't as precise, it might not be so obvious because the drums are kind of in front. But as soon as you remove them, you're forced to make your sequences more clear, make your melodies more clear, and to overall just focus on giving a clear rhythmic identity to all your elements, not just the drums. Number 8 is also a little more on the philosophical side, and it's that you create conscious limitations for yourself inside your working environment. And so, for example, like we did with the tempo, that you analyze your ideas if you're always in the same tempo, you can do the same for effects or plugins. So if you realize on all your beats you're using a similar type of effect all the time, a limitation could be that you're not going to use this effect on your next song, because if you're always using it, there's quite a chance that it has some impact on your overall sound, and if you have the feeling that everything sounds the same, it might be a reason for it. Or another example would be that you're this type of person that likes to stack up layers. So maybe you have one sound and then you like to layer it with many other sounds, and while layering is super cool, just try a version where you're limited to 4 tracks total inside your DAW. So this is all you have. And I mean, people were making amazing music with this in the past. And sometimes if you feel like also you're using the same stuff throughout all your ideas, maybe you need to sharpen your focus on one specific track and making it as good as possible without immediately doing your kind of routine of stacking up those additional layers. Just a thought. If you're interested in more creative input, I highly recommend this video about turning loops into songs, and this one about some super cool rhythm trick that you should know about. Also, don't forget to check out the links down below in the description for like other videos, online classes, or whatever could be interesting to you. Apart from that, I wish you lots of inspiration with whatever it is that you create, and hope to see you soon again at this channel. Bye!